Hello and welcome to Lit Illuminated. I am Rebecca Beardsall and I'm thrilled to have you here with me today. This is a space for us to talk about books, any insights that we're gaining from them, and also ways that we can see that stories and books reflect our lives back to us, give us insights into how we can be walking through this thing called life, but also how we're connected as a community at large. And so today I want to talk to you about Emily Van Duyne's Loving Sylvia Plath. But before I get into the book itself, I want to kind of just give a story about how I found this book. So a Sunday morning, as I often do, I was scrolling Instagram and just, looking at what's going on with the world and my friends and the people that I'm following. And I saw a picture of someone with this book and congratulating their friend on the publication of the book. And my immediate thought was, wait, what? There's another Sylvia Plath book out there? How did I not know about this? And I immediately wanted to go and research the book. However, on the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, we have Heather Clark's fabulous book, Red Comet, and do we really need another Sylvia Plath book after that one? And so I went to Goodreads and I was just curious to see what people were saying in the reviews that Loving Sylvia Plath was getting. And to my surprise, the very first review I saw was, I didn't think we needed another Sylvia Plath book after Red Comet, but this book is phenomenal. And I was like paraphrasing, and I was like, okay, that's it. I went on to my bookstore, my local bookstore online, immediately ordered the book and waited in great anticipation for the rest of the day to get the text from them to say the book was ready for me to pick up. And when it was, my husband and I ran over to the town where the bookstore is. And then we went to the beach that's right near there to, for me to start reading the book. And so I love that I actually started reading the book on the beach, felt very Sylvia Plath. And from the first sentence, I was hooked. And so I just kind of want to explain a little bit why that was. So I'm going to read the first sentence, and hopefully that kind of indicates why this is important. So in October 2016, Harriet Rosenstein, a woman who spent 1969 to 1978 researching a biography of Sylvia Plath that she never published, contacted Plath's daughter, Frida Hughes, to alert her that Rosenstein still possessed a number of invaluable documents by and about her mother. Wait, what? And I was like, is this something new, or was this included in Red Comet? So interestingly enough, that the archives didn't come out until 2020, and that is also when Red Comet was published. So no, this was new information that was not in Red Comet, and so I was hooked, and I wanted to know what was going on. So interestingly enough, Harriet Rosenstein, sold her archives to Emory University in 2020. And really what was in there that, so-called had this amazing insight. But I think even in the book, Emily notes that anyone who following Plath wasn't too shocked by it, but it confirmed things. And that these were letters from Ruth Brashear, that was Sylvia Plath's psychiatrist. And so these were letters that Sylvia had sent to her like towards the end of her life. And I think there's many things that I kind of want to get into and talk about what's going on in this book. I sorry to keep looking down because I have the book in my lap. But throughout it all, I think one of the threads that I found was fascinating was the myth making, whether it was the myth making of Sylvia Plath in some way, the myth making and the myth maker of Ted Hughes in that space, and then other people like Alvarez, like just kind of how the story kind of came out there and what that means. But then there was this other level of women telling their stories and that news getting out there, and then people going, well, do we believe her? And women also feeling like, who would believe me? I was listening to a podcast just as I was reading this book, and the woman stated that, like, she was talking about abuse that she had as a child, and basically just said, who will believe me? And just, like realized that no one would. And so she just kind of had to carry on with her life. And I feel like it's a story that we hear over and over again. And that was also really present in the book itself too. And so I found some new things out, or if I've heard about them before, I didn't remember them. And coming back to Ted Hughes in this space, one was that he really controlled her narrative, Plath's narrative, as did his sister, Olwen. And I also found out that there was an incestuous situation there, which I didn't know about. But anyway, he basically started the myth making at the moment of her death. And to the point that he didn't even tell Sylvia's mother that she had died. Instead, he sent a telegram to her sister to tell her mother and, well, her sister, and that her death was listed initially as pneumonia. What? Like, and again, this was not new. We knew this, but when you know the truth and you know where the story goes and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. He did that. Like, why? Anyway, so this whole kind of, the book itself does this wonderful job at doing close readings of not only Plath's work, but also people that have been writing about Plath. And there are a lot of books out there, also including, looking at Plath's letters and journals that we have already published out there. So there's beautiful moments here that we're getting some really good insights, pulling together all of this stuff that's going on in the life of herself in this space. So one of the other places that I kind of want to talk about is like halfway through the book, and we're kind of really getting into Rosenstein and then place there. And I think what was also interesting is how much people were blocked from telling the stories of Sylvia Plath, and that Hughes would often step in, and Ted Hughes would often step in and stop them, to say that they couldn't tell them, or they couldn't tell the story. Even right after her death, her friends, and family tried to tell the story of the abuse and the violence in the marriage, as well as, just who was Sylvia Plath. And it all got lost, burned, missing. And we know that too of Plath is that a lot of her work, and even her last journals, were burned or lost. Ted Hughes claims that they're just gone. So anyway, to my point. So at one point, and I'm going to just read this quote. So one could argue that Sylvia knew Ted as well as anyone. But what the Bouchard letters made clear was that the image we had of Ted Hughes was at least as distorted as the one we had of Sylvia Plath. So this is where, what we were being told about Sylvia from Ted, and then what Sylvia was telling about Ted, just an interesting insight there. And that this idea that we're learning about these people through other people. And then the other interesting thing that Emily noted as she was doing this work was like, and I'll read this quote, working closely with Rosenstein's archive, a twin mystery emerges. First, who was Sylvia Plath? And second, who was Harriet Rosenstein, and why didn't she finish her book? And fascinating, and I'm not going to give a lot away here because I really would love you to read this book, is that Emily has a conversation with Rosenstein. Rosenstein knows that she's writing this book and wants to kind of know a little bit more about it. And so they have some conversations back and forth, and then it just stopped. So part of the book really goes into this fascination about the people that tried to tell Sylvia's story or did the research on Sylvia and then never actually produced the work. Or that there was some element of writing about Plath in a way that caused them to pause, go into breakdowns, whatever it was. It's just a very interesting note about, the life of this author. We have to remember that Plath, was a woman woman of her time, a writer at this time. And she was a mother, she was a daughter, like she was a complex person. And we, had her stories and her poems to navigate her life. And what's interesting is this other thing about the myth making that sits around Plath is that, and I didn't quite realize this either, but Alvarez, basically, he was someone who knew Plath, and he was the one that kind of started this whole idea that her poetry and her work was all connected to her suicide. So let me just read that quote there. So Alvarez came from the school of New Criticism, which held that a biographical reading of a poem was a poor frame to read through, since everything a reader needed was present in the page. Alvarez seemingly abandoned this concept with the readings of Sylvia Plath in the 1960s, claiming Plath's suicide was the singular lens to read her poetry. And he spoke into her life and her poetry from the time of her death and to the time of his death. And so in some way, he was pushing out this notion that her work circled and cycled around her suicide. And that this is the lens that so many people come into Sylvia's work is just around that. And it's like, it was so much more than that. I think this other quote later on in the book really cements what I'm talking about. And that is, like many Plath fans, they may have understandably believed the foolish story that they were told, that it is poetry that killed her. And they can hardly be blamed for this. The people telling it were powerful men. Once again, who will believe me? Who tells our stories? Who controls the narrative? And how does that get built? And this is like that story of how it was out of Sylvia's control. She was not here anymore, and where that control went, and then who told that story and how did they tell that story. So I have another note of another page. There's so much in here, so good, but I'm just trying to give you some of the highlights that really helped me. And so this was also that how the story keeps unfolding and how we continue to understand and know Plath, but do we? That was to the earlier question, like, who is Sylvia Plath, right? We have her work. We have what we've been told about her and what's been available to us, but we also know that that was controlled by other people and that some of her elements are gone. There was editing going on, things removed from those narratives that we will never get back. And so do we have the full picture? I don't know if we do. And again, about her friends wanting to trying to get the news out there and it didn't happen. So this quote is, the Rosenstein paper, so long unseen by any eyes but hers, returned to us at a time when a version of Plath's story was emerging. 50 years later, that story is still coming out. And Emily notes in here that this was all coming out during the Me Too movement. And we hear through this that the abuse and the violence in the marriage of Sylvia Plath and the relationship, not just the marriage, because I think some of it was before the marriage, but that who would believe her, right? And then the dismissal of her as, an angry woman, she committed suicide and, basically like she wasn't of the right mind. We can't trust her narrative. And I think there's this concept that we have this, and Emily addresses this collective memory of, or this idea of who Sylvia Plath was, and what that means. And we still continue to unfold and investigate that. And that comes back to that original idea where it was like, did we really need another Sylvia Plath book, right? We have Heather Clark's very important text on Plath that takes us from like her through her whole life. Also doing close study in that space. But I think what was so interesting about this is that the author later even relates it to her own story and her own story of being in an abusive relationship and, you know, what it meant to leave that. But also the way that even people who follow Sylvia Plath or like her writing or want to be involved in knowing her in some way, going to her grave, reading her work, get demonized, or it seems to be something of a stage that women go through, like, oh, like when you're 18 you like Sylvia Plath because it's all around the age of Esther and the Bell Jar and just like all that's going on there, but you couldn't possibly value her work after that. And Emily does address that in the book, and I just think, what, like, why does this turn into this space? And all of that is continued around this idea of the myth that was made about this, and then also about her followers and people who appreciate her work and are interested in her. It again, very interesting, the whole concept about how we tell our stories and how our stories are connected. And I think so often, like I mentioned, that the author kind of gives an insight to how her life, you know, she had some similar experience and what she said in there, and I'm trying to see if I have that note, that basically the anger that she felt like from her abuse. Oh, yeah, here it is. I did have it noted. And I'll quote it. So, Plath taught me that I deserve that anger just as I deserved my life. That contrary to popular notions of anger, especially in women, as a pure destructive passion, anger was a necessary tool for survival. And I think this author does a lovely job at kind of really taking away that narrative of the angry Sylvia Plath and just really putting it in the lens of, she had every right to be angry about what Ted Hughes did to her, what life, you know, was doing to her. And that in that anger, she wrote some of her best work. So the other thing that I wanted to just note on this, and I'm going to quote this is the space, and this is when Emily was talking about, do we need more on Sylvia Plath? And it is the idea that we know everything we can know about Sylvia's work with the silence of her burnt and missing pages produces a tense gap that begs us to speak on her behalf. And I think this is what this book is, in addition to all the others, is another, you know, voice out there saying there are things missing. We don't know it all. And this book isn't saying I have all the answers, but it's just saying we don't know it all. And we can't just say, you know, that what we were told is it. That's it. Especially when that narrative was by men that were trying to control that narrative and what it all meant. And so she continues, as she's talking about like working on this book, and she says, quote, it returns a Sylvia Plath that never looks quite right to us, from whom we nevertheless must learn. Faced with this off-kilter Plath, we revisit the sites of her life and death and double and triple checking for what has gone missing. And I think that's the key. We know that there's stuff missing. We don't have access to it. We can't get those insights. And so the way that we move into this space is to look at what we have and what we know. And another interesting quote in this space is, to understand her as a silent woman is an irony that perpetuates these same oppressive lines. She wasn't silent. she was talking, not only in her letters to people that later came out, that has prompted this book, but also her journals, her poetry, her novels. And I think the thing is that we just know that there's some missing, that we only have part of the picture and we will only ever have part of that picture. And the author here also kind of gives us real insight to Assia, Hughes's mistress, and who he had an affair with when he was married with Sylvia Plath. And that basically was the breakup of their marriage. And his treatment of her and her daughter after they died of a murder-suicide. And, you know, what that also says about the whole thing. And so there's good investigative work that happens in this book, as well as kind of insights to even her writing and what that means. And then how she was like, her requests and her wishes were ignored in her death by Ted Hughes. It's heartbreaking. And it was something that I don't know I was quite aware of before. And again, I may have read it. I've read a lot of books about Sylvia Plath, but hearing it through Emily's lens was so impactful. And to the point that Emily talks about going to the area where Assia and her daughter's ashes were, scattered, and what that felt like, and that it even felt like a dangerous place. And I am all about, the vibe of a space and what it kind of tells us about what happened there. And so it was interesting to me that she talked about how it felt dangerous, and that it felt unsafe, but that she stayed and, kind of had a little memorial that she left there for them. And so to end this, I want to kind of just talk about how I feel like in the Boneyard was the last section, I believe, before the afterword, that I feel like Emily just really brought it all home and kind of gave this indication of what she was really trying to do in this book. And so I'm going to read this quote. So this is the chief problem about writing about Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, and now Assia Wevill. We know Hughes made it hard for these women. You know they feared him. You know he made it hard for the women who wanted to write about them. You know somehow he still does, although he is no more, scattered ashes somewhere over Dartmoor. And I think that is the key to all of this. We know how hard he made it for these women. Not only his wife and his mistress in this space, but also later anyone who wanted to write about or learn about or understand Plath's life. And I just think that is a beautiful way to really showcase what she was trying to do here in this book, is to show that he made it difficult for them, and that he continued to make it difficult for every woman afterwards who tried to tell her story, to tell Plath's story, and to get it out there. And then to just end on this note, and I think this is key, is that, and to quote, this inability to understand Plath as many different types of women within her lifetime mirrors her earliest critics' inability to synthesize her popularity with her artistic success. Pick one Plath, it says, you can't have both. But we have had both, because Sylvia Plath was both those people and many more throughout her short life. And I think this is key. We are many people. We develop, we evolve, we change as individuals. We grow and learn as individuals. We also, present ourselves in different ways to all the people around us. We have our work self, our home self, our, community self. But in the end, you can't say to somebody, there's only one version of you. We change, we alter. I am not the same person I was 10 years ago. I am not the same person I was 20 years ago. And I'm most certainly not the person I was 30 years ago. We develop, we change, and to try to box someone in and to say that we know this person absolutely from what we have in front of us is a myth, and you can't do that. Anyway, thanks for joining me today. I really loved this book. It was something I savored. I didn't rush through. I highly recommend it, especially if you're a Plath person. So loving Sylvia Plath. And, you know, Emily at one point was saying that she was presenting in a panel and someone asked her, like, why does she love Sylvia Plath so much? Or what's her fascination with Sylvia Plath? And that she choked up in that space. And you know what? When those moments have happened to me, that's when you know you've hit the spot, that there is something there deeply connected and that you can't understand and you can't really explain, but it's so, so important to you. And so because she had that experience, I love that she wrote this book, that she took that passion sitting inside her, that love sitting inside her, and brought it to us in a book. So I highly recommend it. Thanks for joining me today. And I really appreciate you as we process the world around us through books. Many blessings.